Welcome to this explainer. Picture this. You're wandering through a beautiful historic city, maybe on vacation, and you step up to the grand wooden doors of this absolutely magnificent Catholic church. Right there, carved in stone or printed on a bronze plaque, it proudly announces itself as a basilica. Or maybe it says cathedral. Have you ever stopped and wondered what those titles actually mean? Like, if you've ever found yourself standing in the nave of one of these breathtaking spaces, kind of wondering if a basilica is just a grander, fancier version of a cathedral, or who exactly gets to decide what these buildings are called, well, you are in the exact right place. Today, we are going to completely unlock the mystery behind these church titles.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with what's a name, break down the bishop's cathedral and the pope's basilica, bust a few common church myths, see what happens when these titles collide, and wrap it all up with a beautiful story of communion. Let's dive in.
Starting right off with part 1, what's in a name?
You know, it is incredibly easy to get these two terms confused, mostly because, on the surface at least, they share so many characteristics. Both can feature elaborate sanctuaries, jaw-dropping historic artwork, beautiful marble altars, and massive, bustling congregations. Which brings us to the question so many of us naturally ask, is a basilica just a fancy cathedral? It's a completely logical assumption. We're conditioned to think in terms of upgrades, right? Kind of like moving from a standard hotel room to a luxury suite. You might assume that if a local diocese just raises enough money, builds a tall enough spire, or commissions enough stained glass, their cathedral gets promoted to a basilica. But as we're about to discover, that is absolutely not how this works.
Which brings us to part 2, the bishop's cathedral. To really understand the difference, we have to isolate them. Let's start with the cathedral.
A cathedral is the principal church of a diocese, and its entire identity is wrapped up in one very specific object, the cathedra. Cathedra is literally just the Latin word for chair or seat. Now, this isn't just a beautiful, ornate piece of furniture sitting up in the sanctuary for aesthetic reasons. Not at all. It is a highly symbolic, visible sign of the local bishop's office. It represents his role as the teacher and the shepherd of that particular church, the diocese, that's been entrusted to him. In fact, according to the Code of Canon Law, the bishop is directed to frequently preside at the Eucharist right here in this church, especially on solemn occasions. It makes the building a powerful, visible expression of unity for the local faithful.
And this gives us a brilliant mental shortcut to remember how a cathedral works. Whenever you hear the word cathedral, this is the flow you should visualize. It starts with a bishop who sits in the cathedra, which serves the local diocese. It is entirely 100% locally focused. That's the absolute key to a cathedral. It always points back to the bishop and his local flock.
All right, shifting gears to part 3, the Pope's Basilica.
So, a basilica is a completely different ballgame. It is not tied to a bishop's chair at all. Instead, basilica is a special title granted to certain churches by the Holy See, the Pope. We can map out a visual shortcut for the basilica too, just like we did for the cathedral. A basilica starts with the Holy See, which grants a special title designating the church's special significance. The norms governing these churches explain that this title is given because of a church's particular distinction and its potential to be a really vibrant center of liturgical and pastoral activity. So if the cathedral points us inward to the local bishop, the basilica points us outward, highlighting a very special bond with the See of Peter over in Rome.
Now, what's genuinely fascinating here is the breakdown between the two types of basilicas, major and minor. The major basilicas are exclusively the great papal basilicas located right in Rome. They have a totally unique, direct relationship with the Pope. The minor basilicas, on the other hand, are found all throughout the Catholic world, and I really want to emphasize this point. Please do not let the word minor fool you. In this context, minor absolutely does not mean unimportant. A minor basilica can be a massive, spiritually vibrant pilgrimage site or a hugely significant sanctuary for a local community. The term simply distinguishes them from those few major ones in Rome.
Want a pro tip to sound like a true expert the next time you visit a basilica? Keep an eye out for two fascinating traditional symbols usually placed up in the sanctuary. The ombrellino, which is this ceremonial umbrella featuring striking red and yellow stripes, and the tintinnabulum, which is a special bell. These aren't just random, quirky decorations. They are literally the traditional visual language of a basilica, historically meant to prepare for a papal visit. But, and this is a crucial caveat, just having an umbrella and a bell doesn't automatically make a church a basilica. The title itself only ever comes from a formal grant by the church.
Let's move on to part 4, busting common church myths.
Because human nature naturally wants to rank things, to create a top 10 list.
There are a lot of misconceptions out there about what these titles actually guarantee. Let's clear the air. First, and absolutely most importantly for Catholics, a basilica does not have better or superior sacraments. The Eucharist celebrated in a modest local parish is the exact same Eucharist celebrated in a grand basilica. The grace of a baptism isn't somehow multiplied by the title of the building. Furthermore, ecclesiastical identity is not an architectural beauty contest. A basilica doesn't have to be larger than a cathedral, it doesn't need to be older, it doesn't need to have more marble, and it certainly doesn't require taller ceilings. Some cathedrals are way larger and more spectacular than some basilicas, and vice versa. Which naturally leads people to ask, okay, then which one is higher? If we look at them side by side, the cathedral is connected to the bishop and the local church, while the basilica holds a special title and privileges from Rome. You see, asking which is higher is based on a totally flawed assumption. They are not two rungs on the same ladder. You don't get promoted from cathedral to basilica. They are simply two entirely distinct realities. One defines an administrative and pastoral function, the other defines an honorary dignity and a universal connection.
Which sets us up perfectly for part 5, when titles collide.
So we've firmly established that a basilica doesn't have to be a cathedral, and a cathedral doesn't automatically become a basilica. But what happens when those lines cross? Well, here's the big reveal. A church can legitimately be both. Enter the cathedral basilica. This happens when a church is already functioning as the cathedral for a diocese, housing the bishop's cathedra, and then subsequently, the Holy See officially elevates it, granting it the dignity of a minor basilica. Vatican records have several examples of this, like the Cathedral Church of Kielce and the Cathedral Church of Toronto. There's no contradiction happening here at all. One title tells you about its vital relationship to the local diocese, and the other tells you about its special ecclesiastical dignity and bond with Rome.
And that brings us to our final section, a story of communion.
Now, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, this is a lot of terminology. Why does the church need all these titles anyway? Isn't a building just a building? Well, in the Catholic tradition, visible structures are constantly used to communicate invisible realities. I absolutely love this quote from our source text. These are not merely architectural labels. They tell a story about communion. The Catholic Church operates on this beautiful dual reality. It is incredibly particular and local, but also entirely universal. The cathedral makes that local communion tangible. When you see a cathedral, you are seeing a visible anchor for the local diocese, gathered around its shepherd, the bishop. The basilica, on the other hand, expresses a massive universal connection, tying a local structure directly to the wider church and the successor of Peter. They're physical reminders of how the global church is organized and spiritually united.
So we've decoded the architecture, the titles, and the theology behind the whole shebang. But what does this mean for you? Well, the next time you walk up to a grand set of doors and see cathedral or basilica, or maybe even cathedral basilica carved into the stone, don't just walk past it. Ask yourself, what story is this church telling me about its role in the community and its connection to the wider world? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope you found this breakdown as absolutely fascinating as I did. Keep learning and keep looking closely at the world around you.